So there is an endless amount of books on leadership. There's courses on leadership. There's so much leadership training available for people today. And yet there is a very limited supply of high quality leaders, which makes us wonder what books, what courses, what training is actually effective at developing and cultivating today's leaders. Well, today's guest, the podcast, is arguably one of the best, one of the most effective teachers and coaches of leadership in the world today. And today's guest is Jennifer Garvey Berger. If you're a regular listener to the podcast, you'll recognize the name from the Leadership Mind Trap 5-part series that Nate and I did at the end of 2023. And that series was Nate and I unpacking her book, Unlocking Leadership Mind Traps, which we both believed at the time and still to this day was one of the most essential books on leadership out there. Now, Jennifer Garvey Berger is the co-founder and CEO of Cultivating Leadership. She has a master's and a doctorate from Harvard University. She designs and teaches leadership programs. She works with coaches and senior leaders in their teams and supports new ways of thinking about strategy and people. In her 4 highly acclaimed books are Unleash Your Complexity Genius, Unlocking Leadership Mind Traps, Simple Habits for Complex Times, and Changing on the Job, all 4 of which I've read and can highly endorse. And all 4 of those, Jennifer is building on this deep theoretical knowledge to offer practical ways to make leaders or their organizations more successful, and their work more meaningful and their lives more gratifying. Jennifer has worked with senior leaders in the private, nonprofit, and government sectors around the world with some companies that you would recognize like Novartis, Google, KPMG, Intel, Microsoft, and the New Zealand Department of Conservation. I first heard of her when my wife actually brought back one of her books from her boss at Google that gave her. And I know she's been hugely impactful on a lot of leaders at that organization. I then ran again into Jennifer at my leadership coaching course at Georgetown. Now, and I say all that because she's probably not very well known in the sports world. She's not, the big authors like that would be read by a lot of coaches out there, like the John Gordons. But she is definitely one of the most highly respected authorities on leadership in the business world today. And you will quickly understand why when you listen to her on these next 2 episodes. Welcome to the Coaching Culture Podcast, the podcast to help you grow as a leader and build a better culture. My name is JP Nerman, and I'm joined today by my friend and co-host, Nate Sanderson. Our other co-host, Betsy Butterick, sat out today's interview. In addition to this podcast, I'm the founder of TOC, which supports leaders and their teams to build extraordinary cultures through one-on-one coaching, consulting, online training, and speaking. You can learn more about TOC and subscribe to our newsletter at tocculture.com to get the notes to this podcast and our top 10 articles and podcast episodes of all time. All right, Jennifer, we are excited to have you on the podcast. For our listeners, they will have heard your name before because we did a whole 5-part series on just one of your books. So they can already know that we definitely endorse at least some of your work, but it's been really, really impactful for me and my journey as a leadership coach, coaching coaches. Nate's found your work really applicable as a high school girls basketball coach. So we know our listeners are going to get a lot of value out of the stuff that you have to share with them today. My first question for you today, kind of get things going, is really, you're working in this leadership development space and leadership coaching. When you look back at your life, through the years, childhood, later on, right? What in those experiences has most helped prepare you to do the work that you're doing today?
What a great question. Thanks for having me. Um, the first thing that comes into my mind is I loved books. I love human stories. I love to follow character, the internal world of a character, and see how that translates into actions and see how that progresses over time. So I think my love affair with stories, character, language, all of those things have been super important to me. I was also I was also a crew coach in college, So I did
Mm.
that was the first kind of coaching I did was I started a crew team at St. Mary's College in Southern Maryland, and, it was a club program for a long time, it's now a varsity crew team, and, trying to figure out that stuff out. How do you, motivate people? How do you, help a team become a team? In crew, obviously, teaming is extraordinarily important. If you have somebody who's trying to prove they're the best, the boat's in trouble. And so I think that was also a super important part of my journey.
So interesting fact, 2017 when I started my business TOC, the first coaches workshop I ever delivered was at St. Mary's College to the athletic department there. So, yeah, it's a beautiful spot there to
That
be a crew
is
coach, I'll tell you that.
it's amazing. It's amazing. We didn't have a dock for our whole time there, so you had to wade the boat into the water, which in the winter was really something else. But that is a great thing to hear.
Yeah. So you had that experience as a crew coach. I'm curious, now with you and all your wisdom and all these experiences in the leadership development space, if you could go back and tell young first time crew coach Jennifer one thing, you can only just transmit one thing, what would you tell young Jennifer?
Listen more, to understand what's going on for people. Um, I think I did a lot more telling than
Yeah.
listening. And whether it was about, who wanted to be in which boat and why, whether it was about how they thought the boat was really pulling and why. We were just starting. We needed to raise funds. We had to do everything. When we started, we didn't have a boat. We had just an idea. Um, and I think I could have been uh, a lot more curious about what was going on for other people.
I love that curiosity, that listening thing. It's comes up so much in your work in the leadership development space. Your company is called Cultivating Leadership. So you're obviously in the leadership development space. When you think about your work with Fortune 500 companies and all these other organizations and all the work that you're doing, what do people get wrong more often than not when it comes to how to develop leaders? Because our coaches, they listen, they're like, how do I get better leaders out there? Like, so what are people getting wrong in this space around leadership development?
I think the first thing people get wrong is um, the idea that leaders are people you discover as opposed to people you grow, right? Probably the number one question I get asked is, Jennifer, really, I know that you believe in development and you have a leadership development firm, but really, between you and me, really, you're born a leader, right? Like leaders are born. Just between us, you could just admit to that. And I don't believe that. Like I literally don't believe that. I believe that people change. I believe adults grow, and I believe that leadership is something you can step into and learn to craft. It's a craft. Um, so yeah, I think that would be the number one thing that I'd say.
Yeah, I thought I was a born leader, but I was a really ineffective leader when I started off in coaching. Felt like I had those natural tendencies, and yet what I know is my best parts of my leadership are not necessarily things I was born with, but are things that I've had to cultivate over so many years. And so, yeah, what does it mean to cultivate leadership? I mean, that's the name of your company. So why did you pick that name? Why is it so important?
It was this idea, right, that leadership grows, um, that leadership is as much about creating contexts for flourishing, right? For um, not telling people what to do, but really understanding why are the current behaviors or ways of being arising, and how could we nudge the system so that a different kind of thing would arise. And it, I think people have a sense that, you just need to either get the incentive right um, and then people will fall into place, or you need to tell them really, really clearly, and then they'll do what they want to do. But I think, as we all understand, and I know you've done a lot of work on the brain, right? That's just not the way humans are, right? It's the way fictionalized humans are, but it's not the way actual humans are.
Well, you mentioned the brain there, and as JP and I talked with you just briefly off air here before we started recording, it's something that we've tried to introduce to our coaching audience. And in fact, I've been having conversations with Alex Auerbach, who used to be the mental performance coach at the Raptors, and talking about youth sports. And he said, the one thing I wish that coaches could understand better was how the brain worked. And in your book, you talk about the wiring of the brain and how that's been formed over thousands of years, but how evolution is not caught up with our ever-changing and increasingly complex world. And that makes a lot of sense to JP and I, because we've done a lot of reading, as well on this subject. But how do you explain that to a layperson for the first time that really hasn't thought about how the brain works and how that affects their leadership?
Yeah, I'm more and more into this question of what's going on inside us, in our whole embodied system, that's influencing what's going on outside us. And I think sports coaches have been way ahead of leadership coaches in this domain, right? Because you have to think about the body a lot anyway. And a lot of work comes from sports coaching into leadership coaching, in terms of how do you optimize the body, um, because a meeting is also a high stress event that sometimes feels like a competitive match, right? And under the wrong circumstances can be terrifying. So uh, people are, I think, more and more tuned into the idea that there's their kind of rational mind, but their rational mind is not always calling the shots. There's something else going on. And that something else going on is not just the sophistication of the brain, which is so sophisticated we don't understand it, right? I know you've had a lot of people on who are trying to understand it, but probably the first thing they tell you is we don't understand it, right? We know more about the universe than we know about the brain, actually. And so, but then there's also the nervous system and the other places that neurons sit in the body, in the heart center, in the belly, right? Like these neural networks that are maybe even thinking in our guts, in our hearts. And how do we link up what we know about what's going on inside us with also the way we are social animals that create this internal stuff. My internal stuff creates internal stuff in other people, and your internal stuff creates what's going on in me. How do we understand that dynamic as well? And I sort of begin to pose those questions to the folks I work with, and they get curious about things they haven't been curious about before. If you don't think about that, then it's not at all apparent. But once you start thinking about it, you think, really need to know more about that, right? I'm very curious about that.
Yeah, and I'm taking another class with a facilitation class here this spring, and one of the things that they have talked about with that attention is our what we feel in moments of what eventually we're trying to recognize our threat response, right? And how then that can short circuit our brain or lead us into a particular response. But when it comes to that, like, what are the things that you encourage leaders really to pay attention to as they're starting to learn about this inner world?
You know, I used to ask leaders, like, do you notice when you feel anxious? This kind of, can you begin to notice? It's the first thing I try to help leaders do, is to notice what's going on for them. And very often, because of the kind of construct of leadership and the construct of organizations, leaders will tell me, I don't feel anxious. Anxious is not a thing for me, right? Maybe other people feel that way. Maybe there are some people on my team that feel anxious, but I don't feel anxious. And I've started to notice that in organizations, I don't know if it's the same in sports coaching, but in organizations, people feel busy. I feel very busy. I have a lot on my plate. I feel very busy today. I'm very busy. And I think busy is the new code word for anxious. And I think what busy means is I am scared, right? Like I'm scared I can't handle it. I'm scared I can't get it done. I'm scared there's too much on my plate. I'm over my head. And but we don't even know that we feel that way. What we know is I feel really busy. I'm really highly scheduled. I really have a lot to do. I'm really very busy. And so I've started to tell leaders to notice how often do they use the word busy. And if they substituted the word anxious, could they check in with their body every time they say the word busy? Could they check in and see what their respiration is doing? Where's their breath? You know, see what their body's shape. How are they actually um, sitting or standing in the world? Can they just check in and see what their heart is doing? Right? How fast is it beating? And what people find is, oh, they're kind of breathless. When I say I feel busy, my breath is really high up here. I feel a tightness or a constriction in my throat. Yeah, right, because you're anxious. You're afraid. You're having a fear response, right?
Yeah, and you talk about that skill of noticing. We're going to come back to that in a bit, but maybe this actually is connected here. One thing I want to unpack to you, you talk about you're not just talking about the mind in your work. You talk about mind, the heart, and the body. We just had Amanda Blake, who wrote Your Body is Your Brain on the podcast, a few months ago. And that really was some of our listeners, the feedback was like, whoa, I'm still trying to
Blew
wrap my
my
head around.
mind to that
Yeah,
book, right?
it does, right? But so when you think about leadership development, why is a mind, heart, and body approach so important?
It's so important because I think maybe there was a time that people could run businesses in these quite straightforward ways, and you really could act like people were machines, and you really could, like, act in homogenous organizations and very stable settings. I don't know whether it was ever true, to be honest. But for a long time, we pretended it was true that you could leave the rest of you outside. Like what we really want is just your neocortex, and your body is the vehicle that brings your neocortex from meeting to meeting. That's all we want. But actually, now the body has such wisdom in it. First of all, it's going to get in your way. If you don't notice it, it's going to get in your way. But second of all, if you do notice it, it knows a lot more. It processes much faster than the neocortex. There's way more going on than you can consciously grok, especially the things that are going on interpersonally. And leadership is nothing if not interpersonal. And so it kind of doesn't matter how well you're thinking about something if you can't also be influencing what's going on in a room and noticing what your body is telling you. Because your body knows things often before you know them. And then you react to them and then you make up a story about them. It's actually all backwards from the way we think it is. If you could notice there, you actually have a lot more flexibility. You could influence at the root instead of influencing 6 or 7 causal chains down.
Yeah, and I love what you're bringing up there is just that being able to pay attention to what's coming up in your body and developing that. And I think it ties back to what you were talking about earlier about a skill of noticing. So when we think about leaders developing that ability, how do you help them develop that skill of noticing what's coming up for them within their body? I'm really interested to hear what your perspective is. We talked to Amanda Blake, and then I think in a few months we have Dr. Michael Gervais coming to the podcast to talk about that from a sports perspective. But yeah, how do you do that through your work and through your organization? How do they develop that skill within leaders of noticing within the body?
I think the first thing we have to do is get still, right? To actually be still enough to notice, to turn our attention to noticing. Noticing is so cool because we're noticing stuff all the time. But can we notice on purpose? Right? Can we actually decide I'm going to notice this? Karen Coughlin, who's a longtime partner and friend and co-author, talks about, can you turn your eyeballs around so that they look inside? And pro tip, no, you can't. But you can, like, metaphorically do this thing. And when you do this thing, when you slow down, there's a ton of information that you just didn't notice. It's true of everything, right? It's true of everything that when we slow down and we intend to notice, then suddenly there's more information available to us. But nowhere is that more important than inside our own physical systems, because otherwise our body, which is designed to walk through a fairly simple world filled with physical threats, the body will be acting as if you are walking through a fairly simple world filled with physical threats. It will drip feed you the information it thinks you need. Remember, it takes, you know, tens of thousands of years for a nervous system to evolve. We've had the industrial age plus the age of computers plus the age of AI in the last, hiccup of time from a nervous system perspective. The nervous system is still thinking we live in caves and we walk through the woods, right? That's what our nervous systems believe. And so it thinks we're kind of barefoot walking into a jungle when we walk into an office building. And so we have to do the next piece of our evolution ourselves on purpose.
Mm, I love that. We have to do the next piece of evolution ourselves on purpose. That's going to bring me to another question around intentionality in a second, but just you've led right to the mind traps, which we've talked about this podcast before. We're going to put links in the details of this episode for the listeners that haven't listened to it out there. But in your book, Unlocking Leadership Mind Traps, you talk about the trap of ego, rightness, simple stories, agreement, and control. What I've found since I've read that book over a year ago is that I'm constantly trying to notice, okay, I'm triggered. Which trap am I in here? And how the hell do I get out? Right. So I'm just curious from a learner standpoint, how did you land on this framework of these 5 mind traps? Tell us the story of that real quick.
I was working, I have the privilege of working with these extraordinary leaders, incredibly motivated, purpose driven, and smart like crazy. And I work with them over sometimes many, many years. And I have the privilege to be like in their backstage lives and then see them kind of front stage. And time and time again, I would be having a conversation with a leader or a team, right? Working with an executive team, we would set our agreements. We would know exactly what we wanted to do. We would know why we wanted to do that. And then we get kind of into the heat of the moment, and they would do not just a little bit other, not just like a 10% variance from what they had agreed to do, but like 100% variance from what they agreed to do. We said they were going to listen more than they talk. They go in, they cut people off, they talk all the time. We said they were going to let other people kind of control the agenda and make the suggestions. They tell people that the agenda's wrong. They tell them their suggestions are stupid. 20 minutes ago we had this conversation. Now they're doing something else. And it happens so regularly on particular domains that I started to get just very curious about what was going on. And as I did this investigation, I was surprised to discover that almost all of those domains, yes, there are cognitive biases, which I talk about, but there are also like full on embodied systems. The nervous system, the mirror neuron system in the brain, like all of these systems that are actually creating the conditions for us to do exactly the opposite of what we need to do when we get stressed out. And so that's how I was like, oh, actually, um, this is our body telling us the world is simpler. The world when we are under threat is simple. That is what our body is saying. And complexity blew my mind to discover that complexity is experienced as a threat to the body. That the body says, oh, things are complex. That's dangerous. It's like walking into a jungle at night. That's dangerous. You are in trouble. And so the body is doing everything it can to like um, clear out all that like interpersonal crap and all this like stuff that's going to be in the way of you walking through the jungle at night. Um, But actually, that's exactly what we need. Those resources are exactly what we need when we face into complexity. But we can't access them if we don't know that we're in the trap in the first place.
Well, as JP mentioned, we've done a number of conversations on each one of these, but it doesn't take very long to think of examples where coaches fall into the trap, head over feet, right? All the time. I was thinking the other day about just simple stories, and I had a meeting with one of my assistant coaches, and we were talking about a game that we lost this year. And he's like, well, if you just play both your posts, obviously, it's like, it's not that simple. I find myself thinking that all the time. I think there's even in leadership, in like in communication, we hear about the value of effective communication is clear and it's concise. And there's almost a slant in leadership that we're supposed to boil the world down into simple stories. But maybe you can explain, just first of all, how does that, inhibit us from being effective? And secondly, how do we get out of that? How do we stop doing that so often?
Yeah. Yeah, I think each of the mind traps is useful in its moment, right? There are times when you want to be using control. There are times when you want to be using agreement. There are times when you want to be using a simple story. The thing you don't want is for it to be using you, right? So when somebody says, "Oh, obviously, the thing that went wrong was this thing, and if we had just done that thing differently," well, in a complex event, that's dangerous. To look backwards and say, I know exactly why this happened, and then to project that forwards and say, next time we should do it exactly like that. That is a very dangerous way to operate because last time it was probably 20,000 features, not one. And next time it might be 40,000 different features, not one. And when we lock and load on something really simple, then we lose all the other possibilities. Now, if you are trying to help people understand a direction that you're moving in, you have to be able to do that relatively quickly. So in complexity, metaphors are really useful. Like a simple rally that says we're going in this direction is really useful. Let's be more connected as a team is a useful thing to say. We're going to be working on our connection as a team for the next game or the next weeks or the next year. That's where we're going. That's helpful, right? And so I think we want to know the difference between a simple story that you might tell a story about being connected as a team and get people to tell their own stories about being connected as a team to amplify their desire to go in that direction and their capacity to go in that direction. But as soon as you say everything that happened in this last game is because of how we were connected as a team, then you're probably missing a lot. A lot of how we're connected as a team is what we had for breakfast, and we don't talk about that, right? Some of it is about the barometric pressure, and we don't talk about that, or what was on TV last night, right? Like the many causes are useful for us to not be swamped by, but for us to remember.
All right, that's it for today's episode. We'll be back next week for more with Jennifer Garvey Berger as we unpack more of the practical skills and strategies of highly intentional leaders. Thank you for listening into the Coaching Culture Podcast. We are so grateful to all of our listeners. Please be sure to subscribe to the podcast and subscribe to our newsletter at tocculture.com. And if you enjoyed today's interview, I hope that you will share it with some others out there.